When the door swung open, rain streaked across the threshold and traced a bright path over the tiles, as if the storm itself had escorted my wife into the room. My aunts lifted their eyebrows in unison, my cousins smirked behind napkins, and my uncle's amusement spread like spilled coffee across the tablecloth. My wife set down a small wooden box beside the cake knife, shook the water from her sleeves, and scanned the faces that had already decided who she was. Their laughter flickered and hopped like candle flame in a draught. It had the brittle confidence of people who believed they were safe. She reached for the latch on the box, unhurried, steady, and in that suspended moment the whole house seemed to hold its breath, unaware that every smile in that room was about to change shape. The house had always smelled of lemon oil and old paper, as if history itself had been polished and shelved. My grandmother's portraits of ancestors, somber, varnished, and self-assured, watched from the walls. The carpet remembered the soles of 4 generations. The table carried the small scratches of conversations that had run too long. This was the stage for many of our family legends, the business that survived the recession, the charity galas, the plaques in town hall. There were seasons when these stories felt like blessings, and others when they felt like locks. I brought my wife here for the first time on a Saturday that slipped from summer to autumn. The sky was exhausted and full of rain, and my phone vibrated with messages reminding me to arrive early, to help set the table, to act right. I had not told my family much about her. Some facts traveled easily: her job, her love of old books, the way she brewed tea as if it were a small ceremony. But other truths did not fit inside the family's vocabulary, and leaving them unsaid felt safer than discovering how my relatives would deform them. She had chosen a deep navy dress with sleeves that brushed her wrists, a quiet defiance against the sequins and stiff collars she suspected would dominate the room. She wore a pair of boots that told the truth about the weather. She never tried to look expensive. She tried to look like herself. I loved this about her. My family preferred people to look like us. Inside, the dining room was crowded with voices that kept stepping on each other's toes. My aunt, who believed her opinions were public service announcements, took one generous glance at my wife and mistook the silence of a person who observes for the emptiness of a person with nothing to say. My cousins measured her clothes the way auditors measure ledgers. They assessed hair, accent, posture, anything that could be turned into a number and compared. Someone laughed at her boots, at the sensible soles, at the hubris of practicality. I have learned that the first sound of a laugh can hide its target, the way thunder blurs the direction of a storm. But the echo travels with purpose. My wife noticed the echo without flinching. She stepped inside, carried her small wooden box to the sideboard, and greeted every face with a nod that left nothing for anyone else to define. I cannot pretend my own face was innocent. I smiled too widely and spoke too quickly, apologizing for her without using words. This is how complicity rehearses itself, not in acts of cruelty, but in the soft cushioning of other people's cruelty as if it were weather, unchangeable and not worth contesting. My wife read my posture like a headline and changed nothing about hers. She had brought the box for a reason. The table was set for celebration, though of what precisely none of us had decided. There was a cake with a pale blue ribbon of frosting around its base. There were crystal glasses that had belonged to a great-grandmother who, in family myth, had once hosted a senator and, in local memory, had once refused to sell to a family whose last name maps onto a street just out of town. This was our inheritance: silver, stories, and omissions. My wife asked me, days earlier, if she should bring anything. I told her the usual answer: bring yourself. And then added that my family liked gifts, symbolic tokens that could be displayed like good manners. She had nodded, half smiling, and said she would bring exactly what the evening required. She did not ask me what my family required. She already knew. Dinner began with the kind of chit-chat that insists on being harmless while training everyone present to recognize who is allowed comfort. My aunt recited the season's accomplishments in a tone that made the weather feel like a personal favor. My uncle warmed himself with tradition, the way he always did, as if history were a hearth that burned no one. My cousins told small stories about promotions and trips where they encountered cultures the way tourists encounter scenery, to be watched, photographed, then left behind. Across the wall, a framed newspaper clipping from the Towns passed drew my wife's attention. It was from the late 90s, yellowed at the edges, praising a new development that, according to the caption, would elevate our community. I had stopped seeing it years ago. It had become wallpaper. My wife paused in front of it and studied the smiling faces in the black and white snapshot, the ribbon held taut between two hands. My family liked to claim this development rescued the town from decline. The article did not mention the families who had been told this rescue did not include them. The laughter returned in loops. Whenever my wife spoke, a cousin found a way to translate her words into a punchline that fit a pre-existing script. Each chuckle said she was an outsider, each smirk offered proof that outsiders remain funny so long as they behave. My wife did not swallow or shrink. She listened with the attention of a historian at a crime scene, measuring what people meant against what they thought they were saying. The small wooden box sat beside the cake like an extra place setting. Every so often her eyes flicked to it, the way a musician's ear checks the tuning fork before the first note. She had told me little about her work beyond the general description, research, archives, stories that leave fingerprints. I knew phrases like field interviews, community records, and redacted pages. I knew, by the way she carried stress in her shoulders, that her days often closed on images other people would not keep. She had the patient intensity of someone who speaks with the dead because the living refuse to listen. As dishes moved from hand to hand, she excused herself to the sideboard and slid the box closer. The latch was firm but obedient. It opened to a careful arrangement of folders, photocopies, photographs with dates written in tidy ink. She lifted a folder and, with unhurried precision, placed the first document beneath the dining room's warm light. The paper glowed faintly, like a soft lantern. Conversations thinned, then trailed toward silence, pulled by the gravity of a ritual none of us had anticipated. The first page was a property covenant from another era, restrained and polite in its hateful clarity. It formalized who could live where, who would be thanked for paying taxes, and who would be blamed for needing services. My uncle recognized the address at once because it resides within a story he has told at least 27 times. The covenant itself had never appeared in his version. My wife's finger rested along the margin of initialed lines. She did not accuse, she displayed. Another page arrived, an employment ledger from the early 2000s, listing job applications with terse notes that bloomed into patterns if one joined dots instead of ignoring them. The initials repeated. The denials aligned. The handwriting was familiar to two of my cousins because it used to drift into their paychecks as supervisory approvals. The ledger offered no opinion. It held its facts steadily, like a witness. My wife added a photograph. A faces-out crowd gathered along a fence that separated a construction site from a neighborhood. On one side stood the mayor, the developer, and a line of suits, including a young version of my uncle. On the other side stood families, some holding signs that asked to be counted and others holding children who would grow up learning to count themselves out. In the foreground, a young woman, barely older than I had been at the time, wore a determined sorrow. My wife's hand lingered above that face as though greeting a relative. The laughter sizzled out, then left a heavy quiet. My aunt for once said nothing. My grandmother's portraits seemed to recede into their frames. Even the rain hesitated. My wife reached into the box and drew out a final object, a slim, cloth-bound notebook, its edges softened by years. She set it next to the cake knife, as if choosing between sweetness and testimony. On the spine, in ink that had faded but refused to vanish, was a single surname, hers. The room inhaled. Until then, my family had believed she carried a stranger's history. They did not yet understand that the story crossing the table was returning to its point of origin. There are moments when a room releases its script and becomes something else, when every person present has to decide which world they are in. My wife had been patient enough to let us arrive at such a moment together. She opened the cloth-bound notebook and turned to a page her fingers knew by heart. On that paper, a younger version of her mother had recorded dates, names, places where doors were closed, times when help was promised and siphoned away into better-lit rooms. There were careful accounts of polite rejections and impersonal regulations that managed to affect only very specific people. Each entry had the stillness of grief written while it was still happening. My wife did not explain in words. She let the pages narrate a decade of displacement, a rent raised by just enough to be legal and cruel, a school boundary adjusted to keep test scores glowing, a bank appointment rescheduled until the deposit evaporated, an interview postponed until the position quietly found a more suitable face. Through it all moved her grandfather, a maintenance worker who repaired things he could touch while being told the problems he faced were intangible. He had been the handyman at the very development celebrated in the framed clipping. He had replaced faulty lights in hallways where his own family was not allowed to sign a lease. He had died in the same month that photograph was taken, on the other side of that fence line, carrying a toolbox and a stubborn hope that hard work could negotiate with policy. From a second folder, my wife lifted a series of official letters addressed to families, including her own, informing them how progress would proceed without them. Some were signed by public servants whose names still adorned benches and plaques. One was signed by my uncle, who had then worked as a consultant hired to facilitate transitions. The language in his letter was soothing and triumphal. It praised a future that never needed to meet the people who would be paying for it. In that room, which had been arranged for celebration, my wife introduced my family to itself. She showed a map shaded in honest colors: who profited, who moved, who stayed, who vanished from the records because keeping them visible would have cost too much. She placed, beside the map, a printed biography of an anonymous researcher who had been quietly publishing a series of articles under an unassuming pseudonym, articles that threaded together city archives, meeting minutes, fundraising dinners, campaign donations, and their consequences. The pseudonym was known in a dozen towns, whispered in city halls, chased by lawyers who failed to locate a person within the careful fog of sources. The work had resulted in reopened investigations, apology letters written late, policy adjustments that dripped into budgets with slow, stubborn persistence. The researcher's moniker was modest because modesty helped the work survive. It was also a shield against a familiar storm. My wife lifted a small card from the notebook's back flap. On it was the pseudonym in bold and a list of citations below. She slid the card into the present, into our family's bright room, and in that act the mask touched wood and became real. The researcher everyone had been trying to identify, the patient archivist, the relentless connector of dots, had eaten breakfast at our table for months, had rinsed our dishes, had asked my aunt about her roses and meant it. She had married me with the same calm purpose that now steadied her shoulders. She had never pretended to be less than herself. We had merely mistaken her silence for permission. My uncle looked at his old signature as if it belonged to a distant stranger and then, realizing it did not, sought refuge in the portrait of our ancestor whose sternness had justified so much. My aunt studied her reflection in a spoon and found no answers. My cousins fumbled for a new posture. None of that mattered, not yet. What mattered was the truth, measured, sourced, present on paper that refused to perform comfort. My wife closed the notebook and placed both hands flat on the table, the universal gesture of a person finished making a case. She was not there to humiliate, she was there to complete a record. She was not exposing a secret identity, she was reassembling a story that had been deliberately fragmented. She had come into the house as herself, carrying the names of people who did not get to come here, and she had set them gently among our forks and plates so we could no longer unsee them. Outside, the storm found a second wind, drumming the windows with a rhythm that felt like footsteps. Inside, the laughter that had greeted her had fled so completely that it seemed fictional in retrospect. The room had tilted, not explosively, but irrevocably. The gravity that had once held our version of events together was gone. There is the moment a truth enters a room, and then there is the long, slow work of letting it reshape how the floorboards sit. That night did not end with conversions or dramatic apologies. It ended with dishes washed in a quiet that made every clink meaningful, with my grandmother's portraits resuming their watch like sentries forced to memorize a new oath. My wife packed the documents back into the wooden box with the same care she had used to lay them out. She left the newspaper clipping on the wall untouched. It needed to stay where it could be seen, not by guests, but by the house itself. In the days that followed, the absence of laughter made more noise than laughter ever had. My aunt attempted a message that hovered between justification and regret and landed on logistics. She asked for sources, for context, for the polite insulation of detachment. My wife sent a packet as unadorned as a ledger, links to city records, scans of letters, dates cross-referenced with minutes from meetings that had become muscle memory for people who knew how to arrange outcomes before agendas were printed. My uncle pursued silence, then a minor campaign of distraction, sports schedules, weather, the home repairs he had postponed and now considered urgent. My cousins tested the air with tentative gestures that were less like apologies and more like requests for a version of the past that could be edited without cutting all their favorite scenes. My wife did not request contrition. She did not need my family to perform the right emotions to validate the facts. Her work had always been about the people who did not get to be in rooms like ours. She had not come to the dinner to dramatize her identity. She had come because the stories she carried had scraped against the stories hanging on our walls and made a sound she could not ignore. The last page of her notebook included a line written by her grandfather in a hand that favored neat diagonals over flourishes. If they don't record us, we disappear. She had made it her vocation to ensure that disappearance did not proceed unopposed. Something shifted in me that week. It did not feel like a revelation so much as a confession finally admitted to myself. I had married a woman whose life's work asked a different kind of courage than the one I had practiced. I had been brave in familiar rooms. She had gone where permission was not granted. My family's derision, launched with the confident aim of people who believe their jokes are harmless, had missed and found the part of me that preferred the quiet inheritance of comfort to the loud inconvenience of truth. I felt the shame of that recognition, held next to the relief of knowing I could still choose differently. Choosing differently began with small acts that, in a family like mine, required stamina. I asked my uncle to revisit the letter he had written as a consultant 2 decades earlier. He deflected at first, then agreed to reread it in my presence with my wife's documents spread out like a map. He recognized phrases he had used to persuade stakeholders, remembering how easy it had been to write sentences that used everyone's name and no one's face. He traced the line of causality from those sentences to the months that followed and saw the evictions he had always filed under inevitable. He had insisted for years that progress necessitated sacrifice. He had simply never bothered to ask the sacrificed for their names. He did not apologize, not then, but he put his finger on his signature and kept it there long enough for the room to mark the gesture. My aunt preferred committees. She asked to convene one. My wife said nothing, and the silences in her nothings had become fluent. The committee became a working group, which became a citizens' coalition that decided requests were less useful than demands. They assembled a list of actions with verbs that did not allow themselves to be mistaken for aspirations. They proposed mortgage assistance targeted with the same precision as the harm had been targeted. They submitted a redevelopment audit that treated omissions as entries. They invited the town to listen to grandparents who had been told, for decades, that they were remembering incorrectly, and recorded their accounts with the formality my family usually reserved for awards. The town did not transform overnight. It rarely does unless a camera insists on a montage. But the school board's boundary lines were redrawn with factored weights that refused the old algebra of exclusion. The housing authority revised criteria that had been both neutral and ruthless. The developer who had cut the ribbon in the old photograph agreed, reluctantly and then with stubborn sincerity, to fund scholarships earmarked for the families the ribbon had fenced out. A street was renamed, not as a trophy, but as an address where children would learn to spell their own last names and feel history answer when they called. The policies felt small until you held them next to the lives they touched, and then they felt exactly the size of a door opening. Within our family, the new gravity rearranged our furniture. Holidays changed locations. The stories at dinner acquired footnotes that were not interruptions but improvements. The framed clipping on the wall remained but gained a neighbor, a photograph from a listening session held in the gym of the old middle school, where parents and grandparents spoke about what it had cost to live as the side of a fence that never made the brochures. In the photo, my aunt sits in the front row with a notebook and an expression that has not yet learned to pretend it is not learning. My uncle stands along the wall, arms folded not as a barrier but as a brace. I sit beside my wife, who is neither masked nor unmasked, only steady. People in town began to guess at her pseudonym. She let them guess. She kept her attention on the pages, on the precise work of connecting a line from a city ledger to a family's kitchen table, from a council vote to a child's bus route, from a corporate donation to a block where streetlights functioned differently. The rage that had pulled her into the archives when she was young had matured into a discipline that refused spectacle. She had learned early that spectacle feeds on the very lives it claims to defend. She practiced instead the art of persistence. There were costs. Some relatives took their portraits off our walls and carried them into houses where stories could be told without interruptions. We did not chase them. We let them keep the rooms where the air remained familiar. Others returned slowly, bringing questions instead of gifts. They asked not for forgiveness, my wife had never demanded it, but for assignments. They wanted to know what they might build that would outlast their apologies. My wife gave them lists and then, when they completed a task, gave them another. She did not reward the beginning of good work more than the work itself. As the town adjusted, I adjusted too, learning the vocabulary my wife had practiced alone for years. I learned how to read a budget like a detective reads footprints, how to understand that a map could be both a promise and a threat. I learned that when laughter targets one person, it trains everyone else to calculate risks in silence. I learned to ask, each time a story made my family glow, where the light was coming from and whom it cast into shadow. The small wooden box continued to live on our bookshelf, between a dog-eared novel and a history of the city whose spine had been cracked by a prior reader's impatience. Now and then my wife would open the box and rearrange its contents as new pages were added and new articles were printed. The notebook remained at the bottom, beneath everything else, the foundation on which all the other facts rested. Some evenings she would lift it and run a finger along her grandfather's neat diagonals, reminding herself that the work was not only about documents, but about the steady refusal to vanish. When my family gathered again, a smaller group, more deliberate in its invitations, the air felt different. There was still lemon oil and old paper, but underneath floated the hint of rain, as if the house had inhaled a memory and kept it. The cake that time was not flanked by a box but by a stack of pamphlets describing a new mentoring program at the middle school, a collaboration between the coalition and the district. My aunt hosted, and when she spoke, she chose her sentences as if words were tools that could repair floors. My uncle stood and, without drama, described the contract addendum he had worked to implement that required community impact assessments for projects that promised progress. It would not fix history, but it would interrupt the habit of pretending it did not exist. I watched my wife listen, the quiet satisfaction in her posture only occasionally betraying the memory of that rainy night when she had walked into a room full of laughter. She had not won an argument. She had built a record, and the record had begun to build a world. When I think back to the beginning, the smirks behind napkins, the jokes that felt safe because they traveled in packs, I feel the complicated ache of a person who once mistook belonging for goodness. I know now that the room was not safe so much as insulated, and insulation is useful until it keeps a house from hearing the storm that is necessary. If you have ever been in a room like that, if you have ever felt laughter deciding for you who deserves the center and who survives at the edge, consider what evidence would make the room change shape. Consider what box you might set beside the cake. Consider whose names should be placed on the table until they can no longer be swept aside as crumbs. Ask yourself, before the next story is told with polished certainty, whether you are protecting comfort or nurturing truth. And if you feel the floor tilt, do not grab for the old portrait. Let the room rearrange. Let the record be complete.